One unexpected bill could wipe out everything you've worked for, and most Americans don't realize they're already that close. Stay until the end where I answer the 3 most common questions about this. The one bill. Most Americans are not broke because of bad investments. They are broke because one unexpected bill, one car repair, one medical visit, one broken appliance, hit a zero buffer account and wiped out everything they had been building. The false safety. Having money in your checking account is not the same as having an emergency fund. One is money you spend, the other is money that protects every other financial decision you make. Most Americans have never separated the two. The debt spiral. Every time an emergency hits with no buffer, the response is always the same. Credit card, personal loan, borrowed money. The emergency does not just cost money. It costs money plus 20 to 30% interest for months afterward. The plan killer. An investment portfolio without an emergency fund is a financial plan waiting to be disrupted. The moment an unexpected expense arrives, the money comes from somewhere, and that somewhere is almost always the investment account built over months. The statistic. More than half of Americans cannot cover a $1,000 emergency without borrowing money. This is not a poverty statistic. It is a financial behavior statistic. Most of the people in that number have income. They simply never built the buffer. The invisible risk. The biggest financial risk most Americans carry is not market volatility or inflation. It is the daily risk of living with zero financial cushion. One unexpected expense away from total disruption at every single moment they are not protected. The paycheck trap. Living paycheck to paycheck is not just a cash flow problem. It is a structural vulnerability. Without an emergency fund, every month is a quiet bet that nothing unexpected happens, and that bet loses eventually for everyone who makes it. The confidence cost. People without emergency funds make worse financial decisions under pressure. They take the first job offer instead of the best one. They stay in bad situations because they cannot afford to leave. The cost of no buffer is behavioral as much as financial. The retirement raid. Americans with no emergency fund are significantly more likely to raid retirement accounts during a crisis. The early withdrawal penalty plus taxes can cost 30 to 40% of whatever is taken, making the original emergency far more expensive than building the buffer would have ever cost. The foundation missing. Every major financial voice agrees on one thing across all their disagreements. Before investing, before aggressive debt payoff, before any exciting financial move, build the emergency fund first. Most Americans skip this step and wonder why the financial plan never holds. Question number 1. How much do I actually need in an emergency fund, and where should I keep it? The 3-month floor. The minimum fully funded emergency fund is 3 months of essential living expenses, not income, expenses. Rent, utilities, food, minimum debt payments, transportation. That number is your floor, and most Americans have never sat down to actually calculate it. The 6-month target. Most financial advisors broadly agree that 6 months of expenses is the full target. 3 months for stable 2-income households, 6 months for single income earners, freelancers, or anyone with variable income. Knowing which number applies to your situation is the difference between being genuinely protected and being one missed check away from crisis. The expense audit. Most Americans overestimate what they need to survive and underestimate their actual monthly essential expenses. Calculate rent, utilities, food, transportation, minimum debt payments, and insurance. That is your real monthly number, and it is almost always lower than people assume. The HYSA rule. An emergency fund does not belong in a checking account. It belongs in a high-yield savings account earning 4 to 5% annually with the same full accessibility. The difference in return over 2 to 3 years is hundreds of dollars most people leave behind. The liquidity line. Your emergency fund must be accessible within 1 to 3 business days without any penalty. That eliminates CDs, investment accounts, retirement accounts, and anything with a lockup period. The entire point is that it is fully available exactly when the emergency arrives. The wrong accounts. Most Americans keep emergency funds in the same account they spend from. This makes the money invisible as a dedicated resource and almost guaranteed to be spent before a real emergency ever arrives. A separate named account changes the psychology entirely. The right amount. There is no universal emergency fund amount that works for all Americans. Your number is your monthly essential expenses multiplied by 3 to 6. A household spending $2,500 per month on essentials needs between $7,500 and $15,000. Calculate yours. The overfunded trap. An emergency fund that is too large is also a problem. Keeping 12 months of expenses in a savings account when investments return 8 to 10% annually is a financial overcorrection. Once fully funded to your target, every additional dollar should work harder. The name matters. Behavioral research consistently shows that labeling a savings account with a specific name, emergency fund, financial safety net, break glass account, dramatically increases how often people actually protect it until a real emergency forces their hand. The rebuild plan. An emergency fund that gets used is not a failure. It is working exactly as designed. The mistake is having no plan to rebuild it immediately after use. An emergency fund used once and never rebuilt becomes a one-time safety net instead of a permanent financial immune system. Question number 2. Why do most Americans never successfully build one, and what keeps stopping them? The priority problem. Most Americans do not lack the income to build an emergency fund. They lack the conviction that it is the first financial priority. When the emergency fund competes with vacations, subscriptions, and dining out, it loses every time. Priority is a decision. The small start excuse. Waiting until you can fund the entire amount before starting is the most common reason emergency funds never get built. Starting with $25 per paycheck is not inspiring. It is also the only path a $6,000 fund gets built on an average income. The lifestyle conflict. The emergency fund is the financial goal most directly in conflict with current lifestyle spending. Every dollar going into the fund is a dollar not going somewhere immediately enjoyable. Most Americans resolve this conflict by choosing enjoyable every time, never consciously. The visible temptation. Money in an accessible savings account gets spent. The studies are unambiguous. Most Americans who try to build an emergency fund without separating it from their spending accounts report rating it for non-emergencies within 6 months because it was simply too easy to reach. The debt distraction. Skipping the emergency fund to aggressively pay debt backfires consistently. Without the buffer, the next unexpected expense goes directly onto the debt being eliminated, resetting months of payoff progress in a single incident, and leaving the person further behind than when they started. The income excuse. Most Americans who believe they cannot build an emergency fund on their current income have never done the actual math. A $5,000 fund over 12 months requires $97 per bi-weekly paycheck. For most households, that is 2 fewer restaurant meals per pay period. The fear of starting. The gap between knowing you need an emergency fund and actually opening the dedicated account to start building one is where most Americans permanently live. Starting is not a financial decision, it is a behavioral one, and opening the account is the entire move. The wrong definition. Many Americans believe their emergency fund is the available balance on their credit card. This is the most expensive emergency fund that exists. Every crisis automatically becomes a debt at 20 to 30% interest, making every emergency permanently more expensive than the emergency itself. The motivation gap. Most financial advice tells Americans why they need an emergency fund. Almost none tells them how to stay motivated to build one when nothing feels like an emergency right now. Motivation requires a number you can see shrinking, a target that is yours, and something real to lose if you stop. The comparison trap. Americans who look at a $9,000 emergency fund target and compare it to what they currently have feel so far from the goal they never start. The correct comparison is not where you are versus the goal, it is where you are versus where you were last month. Question number 3. What is the exact step-by-step process to build a fully funded emergency fund fast? The first number. Before building anything, calculate your essential monthly expense number: rent, utilities, food, transportation, minimum debt payments, insurance. Multiply by 3 for the minimum target and by 6 for the full target. Write the number down. That is what you are actually building toward. The account setup. Open a dedicated high-yield savings account separate from every other account you have. Name it Emergency Fund. Set up an automatic transfer for the day after each paycheck deposits. Do not skip this step. The automation is the mechanism that actually builds the fund. The starter sprint. If the full target feels impossible, commit to a $1,000 starter fund first. This amount covers the majority of common single emergencies: car repairs, appliance failures, medical copays. It is not the complete goal. It is the first milestone that stops the bleeding from day one. The expense cut. Identify the 3 highest non-essential spending categories in your current budget. Even a temporary 90-day redirect of those 3 categories into the emergency fund will typically produce $200 to $500 additional dollars per month, the difference between building in 18 months and building in 6. The income injection. Every windfall goes entirely into the emergency fund until it is fully funded. Tax refund, work bonus, birthday money, side income gain. Every dollar, every time. No exceptions until the target number is reached. This rule alone cuts time to full funding by months. The visual tracker. Print or draw a simple progress bar representing your emergency fund target. Update it every time a deposit is made. Behavioral research consistently shows that visible progress dramatically increases follow-through on financial goals. Make the build progress impossible to ignore. The automation lock. Once the automatic transfer is set, pretend the money does not exist. Do not adjust it, do not pause it, do not redirect it for any reason. Treat the emergency fund contribution exactly the way you treat rent, non-negotiable, protected from every other financial decision. The celebration threshold. Set specific acknowledgement milestones at 25% funded, 50% funded, 75% funded, and fully funded. The brain responds to recognize progress. Building milestones into the process is what keeps the behavior consistent long enough to actually reach the full target. The protection test. Once fully funded, identify one real scenario: job loss, medical event, major car repair, and confirm the fund actually covers it for the full number of months. Then close the tab, automate a small maintenance contribution, and check it quarterly. The fund that gets tested is the fund that actually protects. Build the floor first. Every financial strategy eventually gets tested by reality. Markets crash, jobs end, cars break, health fails. The Americans who come through those moments without destroying their financial progress are not the ones with the best portfolios. They are the ones who have the discipline to build the floor first, before everything else, and protect it like the most important financial asset they own, because it is. If you found this helpful, consider subscribing to stay updated with our latest videos.